Well, I think that the climate risk assets is definitely based around a view, which in some areas of the world I think is probably misplaced, that the global economy recovery is well assured and going to be strong and consistent. I think in the US specifically, our view is that we won't ultimately get 1.9 trillion, but we do think we're going to get 1.5, which is a very high number, is going to mean that the overall size of the stimulus that we've seen in the US is absolutely extraordinary. It's probably more than the US economy actually needs, given the scale of the downturn that we saw last year, which was not as big as in our other countries. But it does take a lot of tail risk off the table. So I think that investors that are looking at the US right now, thinking that Biden will get a large package, even if it's not 1.9 through, and thinking about what that means for the risks around the US recovery, I think they're right to think that, well, this really does assure that the US is going to have a decent, steady recovery through this year and into next year. And I think that does embolden people to start buying into riskier assets. Whether that holds in the rest of the world, though, I think you need to be very careful.
You sent us a terrific report just analysing the pace of rebound based on the direction of travel on vaccination programmes here. And yesterday looked like a really interesting day for markets. Even as the US was closed, we saw strong gains in parts of Europe, namely the UK, and we saw strong gains, of course, in some Asian markets. Can I ask you, do you think that there was a moment of epiphany yesterday, that we saw a bit of a watershed in that people went, hang on a second, we now need to buy into the markets where we're going to see economies back to normal sooner rather than later?
I certainly think that investors are now much more confident that vaccine programs in the world's largest countries and the world with the best access to vaccines are going to be more effective than perhaps many people feared. So I think let's say in the UK, for example, and the government clearly is progressing with the vaccine program very effectively. I think anyone who lived here over the course of the last year might find that slightly surprising. So I guess investors now are thinking, OK, governments around the world are getting their act together. This is going to be rolled out. I think perhaps and that is clearly provoking a response. I think perhaps the thing that's not quite right about some of investors' expectations is they seem to be assuming that means that we're going to get back to something approximating where we were before relatively rapidly. And our view is that actually, while this means that there's a pretty quick snapback for sort of the up to 90% of what we had before, that last 10%, which is vitally important in the rich world economies, is going to be a much harder grind. And so for a lot of developed economies, it's still going to be second half of 2023, maybe even 2024, before you see all of the lost output during last year's crisis recovered. And if you look into some of the world's emerging market economies, of course, progress on vaccine rollout is slow or even non-existent in many markets. So I think while the news flow right now is very positive, and we've certainly seen countries that have got a vaccine program underway have been executing it very effectively. So you were talking about Israel a bit earlier, just before the break. I think it's wrong to therefore assume that we can see this crisis receding in the rearview mirror. Actually, I think we're going to get to the end of this year and realise that there's still an awfully long way to go.